says that we are Homo sapiens. We have an intrinsic dignity. If the atheist John Gray disagrees with him and says we are more like Homo sapiens because of our insatiable appetite for destruction, Jesus says, and he comes to give his life as a ransom for many, he comes to pay the price that you and I deserve so that we can have a salvation we don't deserve, because we are, in fact, the monsters that John Gray says we are, but we are at the same time the dignified creatures that Raymond Tallis hopes we are. He brings together those two contrary parts of you and me, what's wrong and what's right about us, and he makes that statement. Remember what Raymond Tallis says? He says that the kind of creatures we are is a question of supreme importance. That's a reflection, I think, of what C.S. Lewis, who dabbled in atheism and pantheism, ultimately coming to the Christian faith, actually says. He says, Christianity, if false, is of no importance. If true, is of ultimate importance. One thing it cannot be is of moderate importance. Because it tells you and tells me that you have intrinsic value. It's proven through history and through what God himself did. The golden rule says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Other versions of it are a little more self-protective. They're a little more self-defensive. Don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you, or do to others so that they'll do unto you, and these kinds of things. Jesus' statement of the golden rule is self-sacrificial. He doesn't say do to have done to you or do something so you can get something. He says do unto others as you would have them do unto you, even if they don't. It's vulnerable and self-sacrificial. I want to leave you with that, because if we take in that message and live like someone else, regardless of their beliefs, regardless of their creeds, regardless of their backgrounds, regardless of their ethnicities, if we take in that message and live like that, then maybe our cracked idea of what it means to be human can ultimately be restored. Thank you guys very much. God bless you. Ladies and gentlemen,
I have to admit, it's hard to picture Abdu in a small purple sweater, isn't it? Here he is so many years later, but that's what time does, brings us to size. And I want to use that metaphor as I speak to you. Good evening to all of you. Thank you for being here, and wonderful to see a packed audience at every level. You'll have to forgive me, my voice sounds a little bit weak. It's never even at its best, even when it's at its best. But now I'm struggling with a little bit of congestion in my ears, the hazard of flying for 40 years and spending half of your life in the air. But if it sounds painful, it isn't. It'll clear up as I speak to you. I was reading a little quip to my colleagues as we were driving here. I have a friend in the United Arab Emirates, and somehow he thinks it is his responsibility to keep me humored in life. Every second or third day he sends me some funny story, at least ones that he thinks are funny. So he sent me one today that I was reading to my colleagues about this woman who'd gone on a vacation and left with her neighbor and left the cat and the neighbor's dog with her husband to take care of them. And while they went on the vacation, she said, "Now make sure you take good care of these two pets." So the second day she phoned her husband and said, "How's the cat doing?" He said, "Well, the cat died." She said, "What sort of a man are you? You know, why do you just get so blunt? Couldn't you today have said the cat was playing on the roof, and tomorrow saying, you know, it slipped and fell and broke its leg? Third day you can say, I'm just taking it to the hospital. And fourth day you could say, didn't make it, it died. Why just come right out and tell me the cat died?" He said, "Okay." She said, "How's the neighbor's dog?" He said, "It's playing on the roof." Well, if you're a dog or a cat lover, you wouldn't appreciate it, but the point is well taken. And as we speak to you on a subject like this, you have a couple of options. You can cut to the chase, you can come right out and try to give your answers, or you can angle into it and make it softer to the reception, I'm going to cut a little bit to the chase because our time is limited, and then during the time of Q&A, you'll be having an opportunity to present your questions. It's a delight to be back here. I was here in 2003 at the university, and what a fond memory I had then. It was with William Lane Craig. He and I were classmates in philosophy in our graduate studies, and we came together to do a couple of open forums, but that was when I had more foliage on the roof, and now gradually it's been disappearing. Viktor Frankl, after his third presence at Auschwitz, said this: "If we present man with a concept of man which is not true, we may well corrupt him when we present him as an automation of reflexes, as a mind machine, as a bundle of instincts, as a pawn of drives and reactions, as a mere product of instinct, heredity, and environment. We then feed the nihilism to which modern man is in any case prone. I became acquainted with the last stage of corruption in my second concentration camp, Auschwitz. The gas chambers of Auschwitz were the ultimate consequence of the theory that man is nothing but the product of heredity and environment, or as the Nazis like to say, of blood and soil. I am absolutely convinced that the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek were ultimately prepared not in some Ministry of Defense or other in Berlin, rather at the desks and in the lecture halls of nihilistic scientists and philosophers." I misspoke in the beginning by talking about the third time he was there. It was after his second visit in Auschwitz. And I want to present to you tonight a talk on what it means to be human, and present to you what I think the biblical answer would be to that question. But before I move into the heart of that, I want to read for you two other statements. What an honor it is to be standing behind this lectern here where Dr. King himself had the honor of speaking once, and for me to have this privilege of giving you this talk. In 1964, when he received the Nobel Prize, one of the stanzas in his acceptance speech said this: "I accept this award today with an abiding faith in America and an audacious faith in the future of mankind. I refuse to accept despair as the final response to the ambiguities of history. I refuse to accept the idea that the isness of man's present nature makes him morally incapable of reaching up for the eternal oughtness that forever confronts him. I refuse to accept the idea that man is mere flotsam and jetsam in a river of life, unable to influence the unfolding events which surround him. I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood could never become a reality. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. I refuse to believe that man is mere flotsam and jetsam in a river of life. I refuse to believe that we are so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. I often have thought, in fact, I ponder many times when I'm crisscrossing the globe and see some other tragedies, and I sit back and think of the great men and women on whose shoulders we stand, whether it be the likes of Gandhi or the likes of Dr. King himself, many others who have fought so hard for preserving dignity and civility, even in the intensity of things that really divide us. What would Dr. King have said looking at the vitriol in our time? I recall speaking last year this very month to a group of journalists in Washington, and a woman came up to me afterwards and said, "I have spent 30 years in the State Department. 30 years. She said, "I have never seen the mood so toxic as it is now." She said, "Ravi, it's unbelievable all that has happened in just a few years and in one generation when the mood is so toxic. How do we treat each other through our disagreements? How do we convey truth speak to one another in a civil manner, realizing that we may have deep-seated differences. I happened to have make a quick overnight stop in Orlando on my way here from Atlanta because my grandchildren were vacationing and enjoying Disney World and so on. And so I took a few of the rides in there, sitting next to my 5-year-old grandson, wondering what kind of a world he will be seeing maybe 20 years from now. And as we were going through that beautiful ride, it's a small world after all. You know, it's a beautiful ride, but that melody stays with you all night long. You can't go to sleep if no, you're muttering away at that. And then to watch him just marvel at all that science and technology has done. One of those was called soaring. You just sit and watch the spectacular display of technology. And I had to hold on to his hand and say, it's just imagination, Jude, it's just imagination, because those planes come flying just over your head and so on. The biggest thrill I had was in watching them have a great time. And so my question to you is, what is going to determine the difference? You know, a few days ago, Atlanta was beaten quite convincingly at the end of the game by the Patriots. What if the Falcons had said, we want to stop the game at halftime because we're winning right now? No, that's not the way the game is played. It's played with 4 quarters. It's played with rules. And what I fear now in America's history, we are trying to change the rules, and we face possibly a dire outcome if we don't live by the rules again. Laws were given for a reason, to give us boundaries of behavior. But the Christian message tells us something beyond laws when it talks about grace and truth. And so I want to present to you as quickly as I can what it is that the Christian worldview gives to you and to me about what it means to be human. 3,000 years ago, David said this, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that you care for him? You've made him a little lower than heavenly beings, but you've crowned him with glory and honor. It's an incredible statement made 3 millennia ago by the sweet singer of Israel who wrote in the Psalms on the glory and the majesty of the created order and that supreme expression in what we call humanity. What is there in man that you're mindful of him, or the Son of Man that you visit him? I want to give you 4 simple truths that the Judeo-Christian worldview presents about what it means to be human. 1 or 2 of them will be repetitive, but hopefully we will also get beyond that. Number 1 is that the Bible talks of a designation, or if you wish, a creation. That there is a designation, there is a designed order to who you and I are. You see, it was, I think, Chesterton who said, you and I can sit and revel in a sunset and pay a huge compliment to how beautiful the sunset is, but the sun will never return the compliment. It'll never look at you and me and talk about the capacity to behold and the marvel and the wonder and all that comes together in truth, wonder, love, security, all these components with which you and I live and for which you and I long. When you see the designation or the creation, the first thing you see is this: there is an intrinsic worth to your life. That worth is not given by the United Nations. It's not given by the state. It's not given by the government. It's given by the very designated and created order that you and I have, not extrinsic worth, but intrinsic worth. Hence the difference in cultures today, where some nations actually believe that the value of an individual is conveyed by those who are in power. That's not what the Bible reminds you and me. It reminds us that we are made with such essential worth, intrinsic worth. There are 2 extraordinary conversations that Jesus had, which points this out. The first one is the conversation that he is asked to define the laws and which is the greatest commandment. And the greatest commandment had to be reduced from 613 laws. Moses gave 613 laws, and the questioners of the law are trying to trip him up, whether it's going to be law against law, religion against religion. Can you tell us which is the greatest commandment? When Moses gave 613, Isaiah reduced it to 15. David reduced it to 11. Micah reduced it to 3, to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly before your God. Jesus is now being asked to reduce it to 1. It amazes me that he could have, but he didn't. He looked at him and he said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul and all your strength. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. He said, on these 2 laws hang all of the laws and the prophets. On these 2 commandments hang all of the laws and the prophets. Why did he give 2? Because of the first, the second necessarily follows. Without the first, the second is with its feet firmly planted in midair. You love the Lord your God, and you love your neighbor as yourself. Why is that so? In that second conversation, now they try to trip him up, political power against political power. And they looked at him and he said, and the man said to him, the lawyer said to him, is it all right to pay taxes to Caesar? How nice it would have been if Jesus had said no. Then come April 15th, you can be both religious and rebellious at the same time and pay the price for it. Jesus said to him, do you have a coin? He said, yes. He said, give me that coin. Jesus took the coin in his hand and showed it to the man. He said, whose image do you see on this coin? The man said, Caesar. Jesus said, give to Caesar that which is Caesar's, and give to God that which is God's. The man should have had a comeback question and said, what belongs to God? Jesus would have said, whose image is on you? That trip-up question failed because they saw what Jesus actually said, even with his antagonist. You are made imago Dei. No other worldview gives you this compliment. You are not God. No, you are not the devil either. There's a Hindi song that anybody Hindi speaking here says, Na main Bhagwan hu, na main shaitan hu, duniya jo chaho samjhe, main to insan hu. I'm not God. I'm not the devil. You can choose what you want. I am a human being. Song says it. You're not God. Neither are you Satan. You're a human being. Well, the Bible tells us what it means to be human. There is intrinsic worth. I remember being in Chiang Mai in Thailand some years ago. I was visiting a house for those who had contracted Down syndrome at birth, and my daughter had gone to see if we could do a project out there. There was a little boy there called T.U., and he was doing some paintings. If anybody else had done it, you wouldn't take a second look at it. But he's doing some paintings. And there he was working away with the brush. And you know what the teacher told me? I forget, it happened some years ago, something like this was his 11th or 13th painting. And people come from all over the world and they buy Tu's painting. You see, he knew that his mother had taken care of him, put him in this home, came to visit him every day, brought him his lunch, did all kinds of things. And when the first painting sold for a hefty amount of money, he took that money in a bag and gave it to his mother and said, without you, I would not have made it. I stood next to the boy and I said, will somebody please take a picture of me with this boy? He's a hero. His heart knew value and what it meant to have intrinsic worth from another human being. My grandson Jude is 5. I've told this story many times, and out of the mouth of babes, says the Bible, you will hear, you have ordained praise. One day my daughter Naomi, his mother, lost her car keys, and she couldn't search and search. She slapped her forehead and said, I'm losing my mind. And he was 3.5 years old at that time. Jude came and stood in front of her and said, Mommy, whatever you do, Please don't ever lose your heart, because I'm in there. A child who learns value and intrinsic worth. That's what the Bible says to you and me. You are not the random collocation of atoms. You're not an accidental blip on the radar screen of time. God has given to you essential and intrinsic worth, and I have no right to violate you, because you are created imago Dei. Intrinsic worth, but so it is, there is a reflective splendor. How God manages this is absolutely remarkable by introducing the notion of the family and love between our fellow human beings. He moves this from the cosmic setting to the individualized privilege and prerogative. What do I mean by that? The fact of the matter is, while you and I share the image of God, you have a distinctive uniqueness where your relationships give you the privilege of a kind of love that they cannot give to everybody else. You are in a relationship with that privileged love. I remember some years ago, my son who went to Taylor University in Upland, Indiana, some years ago, there was a terrible accident on a Sunday night with students coming back from the weekend. And an 18-wheeler or something crossed the median and smashed into this van where many of the students were. And all of them were killed, I believe, except for one. And the parents were informed. They came and conducted the funeral and everything for each one of them. But the one girl that survived was a girl called Laura Van Ryn. And so they informed the Van Ryn family to come and take care of their daughter. She was smashed up, banged up, beyond recognition. And the Van Ryn family stood around that bed day after day, night after night, and I'm not 100% sure how it went, but I think her boyfriend was also there. And the more of the days went by, when he asked questions, he looked at the parents and said, something is wrong. She's not answering these questions properly. And the father got exasperated and said, what is the matter with you? She's been hit. She's been so sidelined for some time. Just give her. He said, no, something is wrong. Finally, one day, she looked up from her pillow and looked at them and said, why do you keep calling me Laura? I am not Laura. I am Whitney. I am Whitney Sirac. Parents were shaken by this, called the president's office, said, was there a young woman by the name of Whitney Sirac in that van? He said, yes. Well, your coroner has made a mistake. The girl that we've thought is our daughter lying in this bed is not Laura at all. This is Whitney Sirac. You better call the coroner right now and get this thing straightened out. Well, the girl was right, and the coroner lost his job. He'd not done any of the DNA testing that was needed. And he told the parents of the Van Ryn family, this is your daughter Laura. It wasn't. Whitney Sirac was finally released, but you can imagine the trauma. The girl who was buried as Whitney Sirac was actually Laura Van Ryn. The parents had to go to the grave, change the grave, the marker. The parents who thought they had buried Whitney came and stood by her side. There's a distinctive and particularity to your life that God reminds you and me is never lost in the sea of humanity. And what he cares about you as an individual is a unique Christian gift with the particularity of your value. Many of you may not even know this. I was 17 years old in Delhi when I tried to take my own life. I had never opened a Bible in my life, never gave God any serious thought. A man walked in with a Bible and wanted to read it to me. My mother wouldn't allow him to read it. I was in critical condition. They didn't expect me to live. The poison that I put into my system was expected to work and literally take my life within a few days. But as that scripture was read to me, never having opened the Bible, and the Bible verse that was read to me was from John 14:19. Jesus said, because I live, you also shall live. And I just muttered the prayer of a desperate man. I said, I don't know what all this means. I really don't know who you are. But if you know what life is all about, I don't. I want the life that you can give to me. I stand before you today as a 70-year-old man. 53 years ago, God changed my life by reminding me that he cared for me as an individual and pursued me all the way to that hospital bed. I never dreamed of the day that I'd be standing in front of audiences all over the world telling them what it really means to live. Intrinsic worth and a reflective splendor. Secondly, and quickly, there's an incarnation. From the designation or creation to the incarnation, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. I don't have the time to go into this, but I want you to remember this. Truth is a powerful and the most valuable thing in the world, but uncoupled with grace, it can become merciless and cruel. Uncoupled with grace, it can become merciless and cruel. And the grace of the Christian gospel is so unique. When you read the prodigal son's story, the boy comes back after squandering all of the inheritance. And the amazing thing about that story is what happens next. It is not so much that he comes and falls into the house at his father's feet, but the father leaves the home and goes to meet him outside there. That was grace, mercy, kindness, and love. All of us need that grace sometimes, especially when we've blundered hard and long and made huge mistakes. In the incarnation, the grace that was offered. I was doing an open forum in Damascus, Syria, and the leading Shia sheikh there by the name of Sheikh Hussein was a very kind gentleman. We dialogued for 3 hours. Between us, the interpreter. He would ask me a question about my faith, I would answer it. I would ask him a question about his faith, he would answer it. And an audience was listening in. He always graciously addressed me as professor, professor, professor. In the last moment when it all was coming to an end, he totally surprised me when he looked at me and he said, Professor, I think I have to say something to you. It's time for us to stop asking if Jesus died on the cross and to start asking why. So the Shia cleric, Sheikh Hussein in Damascus, the leading Shia. I said, Sir, do I have your permission to quote you? He said, yes. He said, it's something we need to think about. And that's why the hymn writer says, what language shall I borrow to thank you, dearest friend, for this thy dying sorrow, thy pity without end? O make me thine forever, and should I fainting be, Lord, let me never, never outlive my love for thee. See, the church has been guilty of showing very little grace. And Christendom, when it was in political power, did not set a good example. I just ask you to do one thing. Don't judge Jesus by what you've seen in the church. Whenever religion becomes politicized, it destroys both politics and religion. The choice to follow by faith is a freedom for you to choose or not to choose. This is the uniqueness of America. We are given the freedom to believe or to disbelieve. We are given the freedom to believe or to disbelieve. Faith that is born, that is engendered within you, can never be coerced. It will not be that trust and that belief, because it's wrapped into love and truth, and the choice is that sacred trust God gives to you. So you've got the designation, the incarnation. I'll just mention one more. Thirdly, transformation. The Bible talks about the transformation of the human heart, how God is able to change the heart of an individual and change it from hate to love and from anger to mercy and grace. I will just give you one illustration of this and mention my fourth thought and be seated. I've had the privilege of going to Angola prison in Baton Rouge, Louisiana several times, and it's about 20 miles out of there. It was the most deadly prison in America. There were over 5,000 prisoners there, 85% of whom are on 85% of whom are on life without parole, and about 40 or 50 of them are on death row. My colleagues sitting here, Abdu and 2 or 3 others sitting there, have all had the privilege of going there together with them. We've stood on the other side of the bars talking to people in death row. Abdu had the privilege, I had the privilege of speaking at their chapel and talking to them about Christ. The chaplain who came there some years ago with the girth of a southern sheriff, ample walk, walked in there and he said, I can change this prison. It was the bloodiest prison, as I said. When you checked in, they gave you a knife to defend yourself. When he became the warden, there was blood on the carpets, blood on the ceiling, blood on the walls. He said, allow me to do this my way, please. He put Bibles in every cell. He held chapel every day, opened a theological seminary in there for them to be able to get a degree, and began to work with them in ways that would give them the truth about Christ's love for them. And they were free to come to chapel if they wanted to or not. The place became packed. The first time I spoke there, I saw the prisoners leading in worship. It was amazing. None of them are allowed to leave those confines. At the end of it, one of the men who was leading in worship looked to me like a man in his 30s. I said to him, will you allow me to ask you a pretty blunt question? He said, sure. I said, are you here on life without parole? He said, yes, sir. I said, so you'll never get out of here? He said, no, sir. I said, you see the dogs out there? They'll follow you within minutes of you leaving out here. We are 20 miles away from the nearest road. I said, how does it feel? He said, Mr. Zacharias, I want to tell you something. If you knew what I did and why I am here, you would never ask me that question that way. Sir, for the first time in my life, I am free. Because out here, I found Jesus Christ who changed my heart. And I'm delighted to spend the rest of my life behind these prison bars because of the freedom that I now have inside me. He said, pray for my parents. They think they are free when they are really in chains. Amazing. The prisoners cooked for us. The prisoners gave us our meal. When we stood in line to get that, I looked at the guy next to me, the prisoner. I said, why don't you go first? He said, hey, man, I'm not going anywhere. You go and get it yourself. Some of them are doing their PhDs behind prison. One of them doing his dissertation on Augustine, another on Calvin, and they were talking in such incredible terms. God changes the heart and your hungers and your desires. And so we've got the designation, we've got the incarnation, we've got the transformation, and finally the consummation. The resurrection of the dead, from the dead by Jesus Christ, redefined everything about you and me and history. After the brutal Second World War, Billy Graham was in Germany, and he was visiting Konrad Adenauer. And Dr. Graham says, Konrad Adenauer, looking out of the window at all of the desert destruction, turned back from the window and says, Mr. Graham, I have a question for you. You're preaching all over the world. More people have heard you than anybody else. Do you truly believe Jesus Christ rose again from the dead? Do you really believe that? Billy Graham said, sir, if I didn't, I would have no message to preach. Konrad Adenauer paused and said, Mr. Graham, I want to tell you something. Outside of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, I have no other hope for mankind. Unarmed truth, unconditional love. Outside of the resurrection of Jesus, I have no other hope for mankind. The Judeo-Christian message has everything that you need for your life and for humanity's life. And God's given you the greatest privilege and the compliment. He will never force it upon you, but this is what he says, who you are and why he has made you in his image and sent his son to lay down his life for you. God bless you, and thank you for giving me a hearing.
From everyone here in the Michigan community and the Ann Arbor community, I just want to thank our speakers so much for coming tonight. We are now ready to move into our question and answer time, so we've got 2 microphones set up on the floor. If you have a question, please come to whichever one is closest to you and line up. We would like to prioritize questions from students and skeptics if possible. When you come to the microphone, please make sure that you've got your question ready. In law school, I tend to start talking and then figure out where I'm going about halfway through. We've got a lot of people that would like to ask questions, so please make sure that you're brief, you're in the form of a question, and you know what you're going to say when you get up to the microphone. We've got staff up there to help you. Our speakers are happy to answer anything that's related to their talk tonight. So if we are ready for our first questions, no, they're still getting ready. So I'd just like to begin. If we're made in the image of God, is that different from being children of God? And if those two things are different, how is it different to be a child of God as opposed to being made in the image of God?
Good question. Am I still wired for sound here? Can you hear me? Yeah. Being a child of God can be used in a very generic sense, where we're all God's creation in that sense, but it can also be used in the narrow sense of one. The Bible says in John 1:12, as many as received him, to them he gave power to become the children of God, to those who are called according to his purpose. So there's that relational use of that, and there's also the generic in the offspring. But the Imago Dei is generally by theologians given two facets to it. One is the privilege of self-determination, that freedom that God gives to you and me. We don't put a polar bear in jail for slaughtering another polar bear because they are deterministic, they worked with their instincts of survival and so on. But with human beings, we give them the privilege of choice, and we do not want that privilege for the destruction of another human being. But so intrinsically woven into the freedom of choice, of self-determination, is moral reasoning. That moral reasoning, whether we call it conscience, whether we call it intuition, whether we call it common law, we have always had that bent towards a moral reasoning of right and wrong, good and evil. So in the image of God, the confluence of self-determination and freedom and moral reasoning is generally historically been given as the two facets to what it means to be created in God's image. And if you look at the history of thought and philosophy, this, by the way, is what sets the American experiment very uniquely in contradistinction to the European scene. Gertrude Himmelfarb from Columbia University, in her book Roads to Modernity, points this out in an amazing way. She said, even right now, I was in France 2 or 3 weeks ago, if you study the French philosophers and you go back to the writings of Voltaire and the overthrow of the monarchy and all that took place, to the French philosophers, secularism and thisworldliness, naturalism was the underlying worldview. It was reason supreme. Although people like Descartes and all really church people, and even Immanuel Kant for that matter, but reasoning was placed on the highest rung of the ladder for them. For the United Kingdom and America, in their enlightenment, it wasn't reasoning, says Gertrude Himmelfarb, it was moral reasoning on which everything else was based. And hence the very histories that followed for the two nations. For the Europe, reason was supreme. For the American scene and the British scene, it was moral reasoning that had the foundation on which everything else stood. And that's why in the early days when French thinkers were coming here and they left America and went back, they would make this comment that there are people of faith, there are people who believe in God. There's the moral reasoning that weighs in on everything for their decision making. This is what actually made the American experiment quite unique and quite distinctive in the Enlightenment over against what happened in France during their overthrow of both the church and the monarchy and so on. Liberty, equality, fraternity. It's fascinating what they are debating right now as about they face their elections. Again, it's boiled down to, is it going to be secular reasoning? Is it going to be moral reasoning? Which direction are we going to take? So the Imago Dei, moral reasoning and self-determination are the two ideas that generally are considered as components in the image of God.
Thank you. We're going to start with the microphone over here. You'll be the first up.
For coming and speaking to us here today. I don't know if this is working. Thank you. The question I have is really in today's world, when discussing with people who are either agnostic, atheistic, they make arguments that their morality is durable. And yet, when you start to deconstruct that, they have a huge block. Can you help with the argument of where moral durability comes from? because it certainly isn't around us as we watch what happens in the world.
Go at it first. Great question. If I understand the word durability, what it means essentially is there's a foundation for it that's beyond mere human opinion, right?
Right, exactly.
Okay, when you look at the great thinkers of the past centuries, when you look at Protagoras, for example, Protagoras is famous for making the statement, man is the measure of all things. If that's true, and I would assert that if there is no higher order being, if there's no transcendent being, then Protagoras is not right. That all there is, at least from our experience, lest some aliens come down with a higher moral reasoning than we do, that we are the measure of all things. When you look at the history of humanity, from its most technologically dim history to its most technologically bright history, which is right now, do you see a marking of an increased morality in terms of viewing the other? I think that we begin to see it break down quite a bit. We've never been more educated than we are now, and as I said in my remarks, I think we've actually discovered ways to do two things. Either annihilate people from the other side with actual weapons, or do it verbally with social media. And we've actually decreased our worldview. David Bentley Hart actually points this out in his book, The Experience of God, that we fail to see the spiritual world around us as the transcendent foundation of morality, because with our technology, we have not increased our view of the world, we've limited it to 4.3 inches. No, we don't see everything around us. Now, I will say this, that if human beings are the measure of what morality actually is, then it does in fact depend upon human opinion. Now, you look at someone like Sam Harris, for example, who wrote in his book, The Moral Landscape, where he tries to say that we can scientifically measure certain behaviors and actions that show the peaks of moral action, because that's conducive to the greatest flourishing of human beings, and that which is bad for us on the valleys of human behavior, that is what's bad for human beings. So what's good for human beings is moral, what's bad for human beings is immoral, and that's how you determine it, through science. The question you have to ask yourself is, why is human flourishing good in the first place? Because we think so? In his book, I think it's footnote 50, he points out the problem of what are called utility monsters. A utility monster is one being who uses the life of, or even sometimes the very life, taking the life of a lower order being for the utility of the higher order being. So cows, for example, exist, and we are their utility monsters. We use them for clothing and for food. Now, on this reasoning, if we are higher order beings, then if cows suddenly, somehow, who knows, realize in the bovine mind that their plight is not so great, they would be immoral to rebel against us. And that simply can't be the way. It is. Because you've smuggled in something. When you've said that which is conducive to human flourishing is good, you've already smuggled in the idea of transcendent goodness. Who says? You, the H1N1 virus, begs to differ. In that sense. So what I would say is this, is that moral values, if we recognize something moral beyond mere speciesism, beyond mere survival characteristics, then we understand something. Justice is a personal quality. Kindness is a personal quality. Goodness is a personal quality. What that means is that they have to have their grounding in personhood. And if that's the case, and they're transcendent, and many skeptics and atheists actually will say, yes, I'm a moral realist. I believe in objective moral values, that they exist independent of human opinion. But moral values are rooted in persons. So if you believe in a transcendent morality, and moral values are based in persons, then you must, I think, end up believing in a transcendent person in which they find their root. And what does that sound like? That sounds like God. Thank you. Great question.
I just add a footnote to that as well. This is such an important question. Are you hearing me or not? You're okay. Maybe you don't want to, but thanks very much. This is such a critical question in our time, especially in a pluralistic culture. How are we going to arrive at what is normative? See, when the anti-theistic thinkers like Dawkins or Hitchens or Dennett and others go after the theists, they will attack the causality argument. They will even attack the design argument. Long ago, they did away with the ontological argument. This is the thorn in the side of the anti-theistic thinker right now. Even Bertrand Russell said, I do not know what the answer is here. It perplexes me. Kai Nielsen, the famed Canadian atheist, We have not been able to show that reason requires the moral point of view, or that really rational persons unhoodwinked by myth or ideology need not be individual egoists or classical amoralists. Reason doesn't decide here. The picture I have painted for you is not a pleasant one. Reflection on this depresses me. Pure practical reason, even with a good knowledge of the facts, will not take you to morality. That's Guy Nielsen. And morality gets even more complex when you think of the supererogatory acts that people do, where the stronger will actually protect the weaker at the risk of their own lives. Like a train accident years ago in Alabama, where the Chauncey family had their 12-year-old girl strapped, cerebral palsy daughter trapped in her wheelchair, and they hung in there through the swirling waters, holding her up till the rescuers could come. And their last act was to throw that wheelchair into the arms of the rescuers while both of them lost their lives in the process. This is what ethicists will call a supererogatory act, where the weaker is actually given the future and the stronger is willing to risk their lives. When it moves into cross-cultural and pluralistic questions, even more complex than that. I was visiting Mahatma Gandhi's home in India. I was astounded by a banner that was in that home, and it was a quotation by Bertrand Russell, who said this: "It is doubtful that the Mahatma would have succeeded except that he was appealing to the conscience of a Christianized people." So there in the home of a pantheist was the statement of an atheist really applauding the theist. It is doubtful that it would succeed except that he was appealing to the conscience of a Christianized people. If we don't settle where we are going to get our moral reasoning from, sooner or later the law of the jungle will prevail, and I think we will begin to see the havoc that none of us wishes to see.
That microphone right over there.
Yeah, first I just want to start by saying thank you for coming here. I know it's as tolerant as this university claims to be. On a daily basis, I watch people who question like the uniform perspective be mocked and derided, and it's very courageous of you guys to come here. And just very proud of my university for its behavior in response to this. I wish I could say the same for UC Berkeley, but I can't. So this question I'm asking, it's not like a gotcha question or anything. I was a Christian for 17 years. I've read the Bible cover to cover twice, and I eventually left Christianity because it couldn't answer my questions. This question is directed to the first speaker. I'm sorry, I can't remember your name. And it's about what you said, your statements about human dignity, its origin and purpose. I'm just going to read it. I wrote it down. Your statements about the Golden Rule and why it exists. You believe that it exists because respect and dignity for human life was instilled intrinsically by a deity. I believe it exists because of evolutionary drive and animal instincts. Every species of animal on the planet puts themselves before other species. It's not just humans that have their own little golden rule. Dogs don't care about the lives of cats or giraffes, but would be devastated if their close relatives died. Every species on this planet fights for the survival of its own race. That's why cannibalism in the natural world is so unusual. That's why, for some reason, we cringe at the idea of killing and eating another human being, because they are one of us, because we survived this planet together, because our species means more to us than any other. That's why the principle of the Golden Rule exists and why we put our own survival and existence above that of all other species. Can you explain why dignity and respect for one's own species and the logic behind the Golden Rule is not uniquely applicable to the human race? What are your thoughts on this perspective?
That's a great question. Very, very thoughtful. Thank you very much for the wonderful way in which you've put it. I think very thoughtfully put. Let me suggest this. When you look at, I think, the animal world, and there's been some studies on this very thing about what amounts to altruism. When you see some evidence, and I remember studying this at this very university, by the way, on this, the altruism of animals, so-called altruism of animals. And what those resort to is a couple of things. You'll see one animal, for instance, sacrifice itself for the sake of the, whether it's a herd, whether it's a troop, whatever it might be. That is a matter of instinct. And they don't reason within themselves, I'm giving myself up for the good of the tribe. They don't do that. There's no reasoning there. I would suggest to you reading something from an atheist that I quoted, Raymond Tallis, in that book, Aping Mankind. He addresses this specifically, the idea that we are dehumanizing humans to look just like animals in our actions. And so he's saying that uniformity you see, that idea that animals act just like us, he says, I challenge that empirically so, that we don't actually see this because what they're doing is based on an instinct. Now, he's an evolutionist, and he believes that it's based on evolution, and there it is. But when you and I sacrifice for ourselves, you have the cognitive ability to actually resist the urge to do so. They don't have the urge, the ability to resist the urge to do so. It's instinct. But you and I can say, if this 70 plus years or 90 years, whatever it might be, is all I'm ever going to have, you are perfectly within your rational rights to say, why give it up for anybody? Why would I do that? And so you actually fight against your instinct of self-preservation because your rational capacities allow you for that. Now, one might say, well, that was developed over time for the sake of the tribe. Michael Ruse, in one sense, an atheist philosopher, would agree with you when he says that morality is an illusion foisted on you by your genes to get you to be a social cooperator. And then he makes this footnote. He says, but now that you know that morality is an illusion, what's to prevent you from behaving like a pagan Roman? Nothing in an objective sense. That's his statement. So the question is, when I say dignity, that's a morally imbued word. It's not an instinctually imbued word. A beaver that gives itself its life up for the sake of its pack or whatever beavers travel in isn't doing so because it's saying, I'm affording other beavers the dignity of continuing on. But you do that. You recognize that dignity. That's a moral quality. It's not a mere survival instinct. I would challenge the idea, by the way, of altruism even in animal kingdoms because it's limited. It's very different than ours. You know, it doesn't surprise me that animals act similarly to us because there are certain mechanisms built in, I believe, by a common designer for the survival of species. But listen to what, in Salon magazine of all places, a place that's not friendly to the Christian faith, as you smile, I can tell you already know this. Michael Lind, in August 23rd, 2011, said this: social animals are not altruists, nor are they strict individualists. They are nepotists. As a rule, social animals like wolves, deer, humans, and chimps show favoritism to their relatives and friends and allies, with little or no concern for members of their own species with whom they have no close connection. So even interspecies, we don't have a desire for altruism. Abrahamic monotheism, he says, insists on the brotherhood of humanity, not just brotherhood of actual sharing DNA. Under the fatherhood of God, Darwinism insists at best on the distant cousinhood of humanity. This is what he says: science can tell monkeys where they come from, and technology informed by science can build a cleaner and safer monkey house, but a knowledge of science cannot turn monkeys into something they are not. This is not a Christian speaking on this. So what I would say to you is that if you want to ascribe these things to an evolutionary paradigm, one, I think it's ad hoc. I think there's actually just one of these things. I explain everything through the evolutionary process because, well, it did it. So it's almost a circular reasoning. It must be evolutionary because evolutionary is how it got here. How did it get here? Because it's evolutionary. There's an ad hocness to that. But I think you recognize, and in fact, the way you opened up your question was so telling and so wonderful, by the way, which is why I compliment you on it, is that you were proud of the university for doing what it did, for allowing people, maybe with a counter perspective, to be able to speak in distinction to other places that might not have been. And you thanked us for the courage to do that. Every one of those was moral. And I don't think any one of those was evolutionary because it confers on you and me something beyond that. Great question. Thank you very much.
I'm Alex Prosey, and I'm an atheist and the president of the Secular Student Alliance on campus. And I just wanted to open by saying thank you so much for coming and speaking with everyone here. It was really inspiring to hear all the stories and all your points, and you really did inspire a lot of people, so thank you for that. Going to my question, though, my question is derived from 2 points that both of you pushed throughout both of your speeches. Those points being that we are intrinsic and that only God can provide this, and that the idea that we are just made of atoms or meant to just populate the earth is kind of silly, that being like a secular humanist kind of view. So my primary question is, why can't we have both of these perspectives be correct at the same time? Because they don't seem mutually exclusive to me. For example, if you take an outlook from nature, from just in general, we may look like a pollutant. You know, you go to the rainforest where humans are cutting down the trees and killing animals and destroying things, and we just look like a pollutant on the earth, or maybe even from some greater being looking down, we could look like simply a pollutant or a bacteria infecting our planet. However, if we look at each other from our family or our friends' perspectives, or even from ourselves, we can find this intrinsic value in one another, the way we spread our love to one another, and that's a very important value. You know, I don't think either of these perspectives necessarily devalue the other. You know, it just depends from where you look. So my question is, why can't we have both? And a little further from that, I was wondering why you tended to kind of put down a secular kind of point of view throughout the talk. It seems like, I don't know, it didn't seem completely necessary to put that down because yeah. But anyway, going off the main question, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Address the second part first, and then Ravi I'm sure can answer the part about the marriage of intrinsic worth and how we derive it from family, but we also seem like pollutants. And I'd venture to say that in some senses, I think God agrees that we are as I was saying before, John Gray says that we're Homo sapiens, but Raymond Tallis, the atheist, says that we're Homo sapiens. And what I was pointing out is that Jesus, in the whole point of the cross, was, yes, that's true. Both are right. But that intrinsic worth only comes, I think, from a heavenly source, because otherwise it's not intrinsic, it's extrinsic, because other human beings are only useful to the extent that they actually propagate the species. And so if you don't propagate the species, logically speaking, you're kind of useless, and you don't have an intrinsic value. You have very little extrinsic value. And by the way, I'm not the only one arguing this. You ask Peter Singer out of Princeton the same exact question, and he'll tell you that newborn babies, newborn, not preborn, newborn babies can be eliminated because they have no intrinsic value unless the parents give it to them. So I think that's one of the outworkings of this, but that's not exactly your question. But why did we talk about the secular, the viewpoints? And I certainly don't mean to single them out. I think, and I actually tried to highlight the idea that all traditions and secular traditions, if you go to look at that poster where it has the golden rule, the secular traditions are there as well about what the golden rule sounds like. I'm not saying that there's no sense of that written on your and my heart. In fact, the Bible says no matter what your belief system is, there is a moral law you recognize by virtue of your design. But I'll say this, the reason why I go from, I was actually talking about the secular point of view on this is because I recognize that humanism shares with me the idea of human value. That's a common thing that you and I, you as an atheist and I as a Christian and Ravi as a Christian, we share that. We share that. I want to affirm that in you, and your question suggests that that's something we both should look for and strive for. So absolutely correct. But sometimes in order to show the clarity of one position, you have to compare it with something else. Our colleague Os Guinness often says this, comparison is the mother of clarity. And I think that we have to do that in order to show the differences between two views. There are other views, there are other theistic and non-theistic views that we could have compared it to. But the secular view, I think, is one that provides a certain amount of clarity upon which to answer the questions we're facing. What does it mean to be human? So that's part of it. I'm sure there's more to come.
It's a great question. Again, you can just see how much the question of purpose, value, meaning, morality, and all sort of come into play in all of these questions. Let me take the second one first because it's actually simpler to deal with, and then move to the first one. Secularism or secularization. If you go back to the 70s and 80s, Peter Berger from Boston was sort of a seminal thinker in this area. I've had the privilege of talking to him, had the privilege of even interviewing him. Writing in the 80s, he himself saw sort of the end of Christendom coming, the end of the Christian worldview. He sat in our radio studio and said these very words. He said, I was wrong. I was wrong. I had not at all thought of what evangelicalism was going to accomplish in the lives of millions of people all over the world. But he defined secularization in these ways, where religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations have lost their social significance, where religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations have lost their social significance. Now, I think we have to be careful here. It is a good thing to have a secularized leadership and government oversight, because you cannot force religion on anybody in a pluralistic society. But if secularism means that there is no vertical possibility for life, if it means that you cannot allow the freedom for people to believe and trust in a divine creator, then it is not just secularization, it is a hostile imposition of a this-worldliness. It will never work. Even if the Christians were to just lay down and give up the fight on this, there are other worldviews that simply will not tolerate a totally secularized consciousness. A person in one of these worldviews said to me when I was traveling, he said, "Let me tell you something, how I see my faith versus the Westerner's faith." And he drew two circles, and it told me everything I needed to know. In that circle, that big circle, he put a dot. In the other circle, he also put a dot. He said, the left circle is the Westerner's faith, the right circle is my faith. When I look at that big circle and a dot, he said, for the Westerner, the dot is their faith, the circle is their life. And they're willing to give up the dot to keep the circle. He said, when you come to me, the dot is my life, the circle is my faith. He said, it encompasses everything that I do, and nobody will ever be able to knock it out of me. So if you were to ask the same question in some countries of the world, you'd be very fortunate if you didn't get silenced in some way. Because we live in a pluralistic society where we give the privilege in a secularized consciousness that there may be a transcendent worldview and a vertical worldview. So I just say to you, seculum from the Latin means this worldly. And if we interpret everything from a this worldly perspective and do not give the possibility of the vertical, we will end up with exactly where we have ended up. Right and left, no up and down. And you've got all this shouting and vilifying going on because the only thing we've got to argue for is right. Nietzsche, the atheist, said, is there any up or down left? What sacred games will we need to invent? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the horizon? Are we not perpetually falling? Will not lanterns have to be lit in the morning hours? That was an atheist saying. How are we going to light our way into the future? So secularism, and I think it is Anthony Kronman, who from Yale has written this book right now on how secularism was failed by the university. The university didn't do justice to it. I've responded to him in my book, Jesus Among Secular Gods. Several pages. Why it failed was because it really did not have the coherence, not because it wasn't taught. And that's why Anthony Flew, the philosopher, Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, all of them ended up in the latter part of their lives saying, this naturalistic framework has been incoherent for us. Now, in terms of the difference between a quantity versus an entity, there's a world of a difference. There's a world of a difference. We are not just quantities. We are not just quantities that have come into being by some kind of atomic coming together. We are given the credit of a will, and you use the word love in your question, which can legitimately be used in a quantified universe. It is a metaphysical proposition, and dare I suggest to you, a spiritual proposition. And C.S. Lewis, in his book on four loves, talks about the four loves we experience. Agape love, phileo, which is brotherly love, storge, which is protective love, and eros, which is romantic love. And he clearly points out that the latter three will have no base on which to stand if you do not have love itself defined from a vertical perspective. So the very question of love becomes ultimately undefinable in a secular horizontal axis. So my suggestion to you is a great question, and when you answer that from the Judeo-Christian worldview, the answers are very coherent. Answer it from the secular worldview, it fails to even justify the question. Thank you.
Ravi, in your talk, and even right now, you speak of the divisions and how there's a right and a left, and how you fear for America, and how we have just gotten so far from the principles and the laws of humanity, and I think that a lot of us in America have different fears and are very split in different ways. And so I'm wondering, with the intrinsic worth that you guys have laid out for us tonight, how do we personally take that from this place and practice it, but also how do we do that as a country?
Yeah, we as those who are in the realm of philosophy and ethics, and especially with the Judeo-Christian worldview, we try to be very careful not to get into the political arena. I write sometimes, and my teammates pour a bucket of water on my head to cool me down after that. I would love to say a lot about what I see is happening, and it's very sad. And by the way, this did not happen in the last few months. This has been happening for years. The whole language of intensity and animus and the division of the country, whether it's this way or that way. When I left India, I was 20 years old. My brother was 22. We were given $400 each I went to Canada to find a living and make our home there. I'm always grateful to my dad that he trusted us to do that because things were getting tough in India at that time. I remember going to see the Canadian interviewing agent. We had to spend 1 hour being interviewed in our move to Canada. All kinds of questions. And he just bore down on our background, our intentions, and I'm talking about 1966, over 50 years ago. And then he looked at my brother and me, he said, I finally have one question for both of you. Why do you want to move to Canada? And I wanted to just say, I want to make a living. I want to make a healthy living. My brother, who was 2 years older than me, just put his arm out to keep me silent. And he said this, Sir, we think in English. He didn't speak Hindi at all. I'm very fluent in Hindi. All of my friends spoke Hindi, so I don't know where this was coming from. We think in English. But the man caught on. He said, tell me more. And my older brother said, we have a value structure in which we've been raised. Now, my ancestors were Orthodox Hindu priests from the highest caste. Somewhere, some generations ago, there was a conversion and then a reversion and went on. I was the first, my sister and I were the first in the family to give our lives to Christ, and then one by one, the whole family followed. So I'm just telling you this, it wasn't a religiously guided conversation. But my brother was saying, we have values that are best represented in the West. And one of the things he said, and if you ask any Indian today, what is India's greatest strength? I'll tell you brain power, engineers, doctors, brilliant thinkers, scientists. You ask any Indian, what is India's greatest bane? What is the greatest weakness? He'll say, our culture is so corrupt that it is destroying the country. And this last Prime Minister ran on the platform of removing corruption. So my brother's point was this, I want to go to a land, I want to go to a country, not that's perfect, but that's where such open corruption is not tolerated, that corruption is dealt with. 50 years later now, you begin to wonder, is it now a level playing field? Are we as corrupt all over the globe and as power corrupted and power corrupting? Absolutely. I don't know. But in this worldview, there are checks and balances that are able to catch the corruption a little more easily. And the values my brother was talking about was hard work, dignity of labor, freedom to express, freedom to succeed, and raise your family and build your own future. What has happened to us now? If we cannot even talk to each other in a civil way, and I'm talking on both sides of the aisle, and by the way, I speak to both sides of the aisle. If we cannot even talk to each other in a civil way, we are sending a horrible example to our young to say that unless you think like me, I'm going to be intolerant of you. We can't live that way. We can't live that way. Let me make two comments. First, I want to thank the university authorities. Whoever you are, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for giving us the privilege of speaking at an auditorium like this. The fact that you would open up a hall and make it possible for us to address these issues, that's what universities are all about, bringing unity in diversity. So thank you. Years ago, I spoke at the United Nations Christmas dinner. It was the first time I was speaking at that level of an audience. I was terrified. I was sitting at a table, and I tried to make conversation with one of the UN ambassadors. So just to make conversation, I said to him, "What is the greatest strength of the UN?" He looked at me, he said, "That we are talking to each other rather than not talking to each other." I said, "Wow, that's pretty good." I said, "So that begs the next question. What is the greatest weakness?" He said, "We don't speak the same language." I said, "You have interpreters, right?" He said, No, I'm not talking about that. He said, "You see that man 5 tables away? The only reason we both agreed to come is if we didn't sit at the same table. We made a precondition that he sits at a different table to me." He says, "You know why? Because when I talk peace, I mean get rid of the guns. When he talks peace, it means with his guns aimed in my direction. So we don't mean the same thing when we use the same language." You know, it's sad when the weapons of destruction are piling up and we don't even know what the other person means. America has a vital role to play in the world, very vital role. One Russian said to me in Moscow, and with this I'll close, I was there last June, I think. He asked if he could have breakfast with me. The place was packed. And he said to me, once upon a time, if you had come here, the only Bible was in the Kremlin. He said, now there's thousands of Bibles in the audience that you're speaking to them. But he said this. He said, "Mr. Zacharias, I have to be honest with you." And he leaned forward in a whisper. He said, "My only hope for the future of the world was America." It's a Russian. He said, "I've lost that hope. They don't think rightly there anymore." We better start thinking rightly. We better start at the highest powers and the leading places to sit down across a table, shake hands and say, we don't have to agree, but we can stop being disagreeable and stop poisoning the wells and distorting news. Let us give it like it is. The greatest privilege we have is the ballot box. Let's not lose that privilege. It's a privilege that we'll cherish. In Singapore, 5 Cambodian young people came to intern in a hotel. And the general manager of the Raffles Hotel told me this. When they were leaving, she sat them down to share what was the most exciting experience coming from Cambodia to Singapore. She said she thought she was going to think of the transit, the trains, all of the highways and the skyscrapers. The number one answer was a 3 p.m. ice cream break. We take so much for granted in this country. God's given us a country with plenty of ice cream and plenty of breaks and plenty of wonderful things. Let's not destroy what God has put into us, and it begins with civil discourse, not with uncivil attacks. That's what I say.
Hi, I want to thank you too for coming here. My question is something Dr. Ravi said, was that there's no other worldview that gives humans intrinsic being. So what I've been trying to make of is, why are there communities that are so much better at respecting and loving each other than the Christian church is?
Well, that was directed towards Dr. Zacharias, but let me just come from an outsider's perspective. I wasn't growing up in the church. And so there's a level to which I kind of see things from an outsider perspective. It's been 16 years, but still, the fact of the matter is I still see some outsider stuff that happens. Let me suggest this to you, if I could, with all candor and all honesty towards other systems as well. 2 things. The first thing is this. I've seen other places, whether places of worship or communities of worship or non-worship. Everybody acts the same way. This is not a thing that's only the church. The reason why the question actually pertains is because the church is called to a higher standard based on the one it follows, who treated everybody, even dissidents and even those within the ranks who were always failing, with dignity and respect. And so we see that oftentimes, yes, disagreements happen, but the church's example is Jesus himself, and of course his apostles, who sometimes saw the disagreements that were happening, but they treated it with discourse and trying to bring people back into, with a beautiful speech, with some kind of a way to convince people of what was true and beautiful and lovely. That's why the Apostle Paul says, whatever is lovely, beautiful, honorable, all these things, honest and true, think on these things. Don't think of the other person in a way that is less, because love hopes all things, believes all things, is patient, is kind, and all these things. That's the embodiment of the Christian ideal, because we follow the one who is the embodiment of love, who is Christ, who does all those things for us. So that's why I think the contrast seems to be the way it is. The church seems to look a little bit worse than the rest of the world, and in some places that's true. We do that. One of the things that happens oftentimes, and this is a reality, one of our colleagues, Sam Albury, who's dealt with some very, very serious issues in his own life, has seen the way the church has reacted. Other colleague friends of ours who've had sexual struggles, who have had other struggles in their lives, not just our colleagues who have come from a different background, but all over the world we see it. Sometimes they don't tell the people in the church because they're worried that's where they'll get hit the most. And that's just the reality, I think, of how people can get judgmental and self-righteous. But I'll tell you this, coming from an outsider's perspective, I've seen the other side of it, and I've seen that it's not so different after all. Because here's a truism that the church teaches. People are sinful. And we'll all act that way. All of us will. And that goes my second point, is that this is not a strike against the Christian church. Well, it might be a strike against the way that Christendom is expressed, yes, but it's not a strike against the gospel itself, because Christians behaving badly doesn't prove Jesus wrong. It actually proves him right, because he said people act that way. Human sin is a doctrine of the Christian faith, which I think it was Muggeridge who said that it is once the most resisted idea in all of Christendom, but it's also the one with the most empirical evidence for it. And I think it was Philip Yancey who said, the fact that the Christian church behaves badly is actually proof that it's right about human sinfulness. But we have that hope that comes from without. So we have that standard we have to live by. And it is a shame. It's not an excuse to do bad things. It's simply, in fact, we have to be convicted more of the things that we do that are poor, because there are those who are looking from the outside and saying, why would I join that? Why would I do that? And this goes back to something about Jesus that I absolutely love. This is something that I just think is so important for us to understand here. Jesus made a comment, and it's a controversial comment, especially for his day. He says, for out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, theft, false testimony, and slander. These are what defile a person. He makes that statement about you and me. What he's pointing about in my heart and in your heart is that you're evil. That's a terrible recruiting poster. You're evil, come follow me. What's interesting, it's hard to get followers, but he did. Somehow he did. What I love about this statement is this. Jesus doesn't tell you what you want to hear. He tells you what you need to hear. And every other worldview, whether it's religious or non-religious, basically tells you that you can be the solution to your own problem, failing to recognize that because you're the problem, you can't solve you. Is that if we do enough good things, we'll please God, or if we do enough meditation, we'll become God, or if we educate ourselves enough, we'll have a Star Trek-like existence in a utopian society. See the faith in us? And the Christian message that Jesus says is that, no, that's not how it actually works. And he tells you like it is, not how you'd like it to be. But then he provides that remedy, which is the cross itself, that says that because you're that way, but I can do it. And if you just accept that, that's the change. The church needs to act like it has been redeemed. That's my answer to you. Thank you so much.
This next question is going to be our last for Ravi and Abdu, but if you've still got questions when we're done, please come on up to the front. We will have people here that would be more than happy to hear anything that you have to say.
Oh, thank you. Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you for coming. It's an honor. I just have a brief preface for you. In my history class, we are going over what is a human. From a scientific perspective, we are trying to construct a threshold for what atomically makes a human. From an intellectual level, would you say morality, thinking, and the ability to believe are what makes a human? Or do other words such as faith, devotion, and emotion need to be considered also or instead?
I'll go first and let Abdu close and even give a closing statement after that. The very Latin word from which we get individual is that we cannot be divided up, cannot be carved up. We are indivisible. And so we are really a composite. We can't say we're just emotion or just intellect or just will or just psychological disposition. God views us as whole beings. That's why we are not quantities. You see, a half a slice of bread and half a slice of bread may make one slice of bread, but half a baby and half a baby don't make one baby. Solomon proved that at the city gate right from the beginning. You cannot carve up a person. And if you only view this from history, you will end up viewing man phenomenologically by the phenomenon that we call humanity. And if you view us phenomenologically, you will run into a wall because the phenomena are actually different in different cultures. They are so different not only in different cultures, but even in different households. You watch the way, if I'd grown up observing just my father and my mother for the first 20 years of my life, I would have just thought men are cruel, bullies, insulting, bad-tempered and all of that, and women show how they are iconic in their love and mercy and kindness. That's in that microcosm, I would have come to extreme solutions. But then I watched as years went by and watched how we all have that bent towards our choices. And when my father died, he was only in his 60s. My mother died when she was in her 50s. And I remember my dad standing by my mother's coffin, really, weeping and begging for forgiveness for the way he had treated her in all those years. And I had to put my arm around my dad at that time. But before my dad passed on, I saw a change in his life that was so dramatic, so incredible. And I dare suggest to you it happened when he met Christ in his own life. He died at the age of 67 and asked me if I was living in Niagara Falls, Ontario at that time. He was in Toronto. Asked me to drive to pick him up. He had to go to the hospital. Why do we Easterners use anecdotes? We use anecdotes because we see so much we can infer from the anecdotal experience. So rather than calling my brothers and sisters, he called me. And he said, I want you to take me. I said, Dad, I'm 75 miles away. My older brother is 10 minutes away. I'll come. But why don't you have him take you? He said, no, I want you. So I got on to that Queenie and drove for 90 minutes. I picked him up. I wasn't prepared for what I was going to hear. And he told me of all of the years of anger, bullying, and the nastiness that he showed towards me and begged for forgiveness as he was taken to. He never came back after that surgery. That was my last conversation with my father. If I took that microcosm of my household, what conclusions would I have drawn if I'd drawn it at age 17, at age 20, at age 30? And so when you take the paradigm and move it across humanity, you can't just go with phenomena. You have to go with essence. And it is essence that defines existence, not the other way around. The entire existential experiment was that existence precedes essence. And both Sartre and Camus, in effect, said it couldn't actually be. When Sartre was railing against the Vietnam War, he realized he was invoking a moral law that he himself had said was only existentially chosen. So I say to you that when you're studying humanity, you have to take all of the disciplines into play. And I put it this way. Number one, you search for truth. Number two, correspondence and coherence theories of truth. Number three, logical consistency, empirical adequacy, experiential relevance. Number four, the four questions of life: origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Truth, correspondence, coherence, logical consistency, empirical adequacy, experiential relevance, the 4 questions of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Now you go to the 5 disciplines of God, knowledge, reality, anthropology, and ethics. You put the 5 disciplines together, that's what you must bring to bear to determine what it means to be human, not just carve the human being up into one faculty. God, knowledge, reality, epistemology, ethics. That's why you come to universities. It is to find unity in diversity. You can't take a single subject to explain all there is of humanity. And I think the Christian worldview brings those 5 disciplines together. And that's a bit of a heavy dose at night, but have a good sleep. It's a small world after all. God bless you.
If I could just, I'm sorry, I didn't know if it was over now, but since I stood up, I'm going to say something. Part of your question asked the question historically, history class, is that right? Okay, not in a biology class, it was a history class. Okay, so this is more of a historical or philosophical question because I think sometimes people want to parse out when do we become human in terms of the various controversies that exist around when human life actually begins. But as Ravi talked about, it's not just one capacity, it's the conglomeration of capacities, but it's not just the capacities, it's the potential for the capacities that makes you uniquely human, which makes a chemical makeup, a human and chemically is different than a cow chemically, because there's the capacity for these capacities as well, there's a potential for these capacities as well. But you know what's interesting is that you look at the word. You see, we're asking the question: what is human? What in distinction to other animals? I think the question ought to be asked in this way as well. We can't forget this. What does it mean to be a person? Because we ask what is human in terms of chromosomal and biological, but we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be a person? This is not an obvious question. See, the word person actually comes from the Latin persona, which means mask. In other words, you were given personhood by someone else. It was conferred upon you in the Roman Empire by the government, because being born